What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Alpha Girl Confidence Podcast. This is episode 250, and it is our first episode of 2024, and it is a good one. So in this episode, I sat down with Lauren Fleshman, who is one of the most decorated American distance runners of all time, having won 5 NCAA championships at Stanford and 2 national championships as a professional. Yet, like most elite runners, Lauren's decorated career is filled with many failures and heartbreaks, from missing the Olympics twice due to injuries and coming in dead last at the Olympic trials in 2012. Throughout her quest to win and be the best in her sport, she has always had this awareness that something isn't quite right with the system in female athletics, which is the premise of our conversation and her book, Good for a Girl, which is linked below. So make sure you go check out the book. But in this conversation, we got into a lot, but our real focus was on eating disordered habits and how the system has kind of perpetuated that with female athletes. We talk about puberty and how it's just not talked about, but it is how it is one of the most common ways that girl athletes quit sports. We talked about her experience with puberty. We talked about different solutions with coaches, with parents, what they can look out for and helping guide their girl athletes through kind of this tumultuous time as a female athlete going through puberty. We talked about body image. We just talked about so many great things that are absolutely necessary in having these conversations in female athletics. It's conversations that I never had, that I never thought about. And I just know that it's so important. If we want to change the system, we've got to start with education. And this conversation, and definitely Lauren's book, is the place to start. So I've said this in my emails before, but if you're a parent, if you're a coach, if you're a female athlete, Lauren's book, Good for a Girl, is one of the most important books you can pick up, whether you're a runner or not. Doesn't matter what sport you play. If you work with female athletes in any way, or if you are one, please, please, please do yourself a favor, do women's sports a favor, and pick up this book. Again, everything will be linked below for you to grab the book and for you to connect with Lauren further. All right, hope you enjoy the conversation. Hey, Lauren, what's up? Welcome to the Alpha Girl Confidence Podcast. This is one of my most anticipated conversations that I've ever had because your book was absolutely phenomenal. So I'm so excited that you've had the opportunity to join us.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to hear what things stood out to you and in the book, and what kind of caught your interest.
Yeah, I mean, I have the book here, and my wife is reading it now, and she's like dog-eared like so many pages. It's just like there's so many dog ears in here. So we've been having a lot of discussion too, because I was like, I want to know, like, you know, what are things that stood out to you as well. So to have this conversation with you in the flesh virtually, I'm really excited about. So first, I just want to know, like, what was the why behind this book, and like when did you feel called to like start writing this, and kind of the purpose behind it?
Well, I was always really motivated to be my best, and so I was a competitive person, and wanting to be your best in an area means really trying to optimize the system you're in, right? Like, how do I come out on top of this system? So that was my background. I was a very competitive person. So that was one element of it, was it made me pay really close attention to the system I was a part of, what was holding me back and what was also holding my peers back. So the second part of my personality is like, I'm really a team player, and I like love very deeply, and I'm a very sensitive person. And so seeing my teammates in a team sport not thriving the way that coaches expected them to, the way they expected themselves to, and then what the fallout was for that. Yeah. Watching that happen all around me, even when during the times of my career where it wasn't impacting me directly, also kind of pushed me to pay even closer attention. Like, what's going on here? What's going wrong here? And then it took it took multiple decades to solve that mystery, and it took kind of succumbing to some of the pressures myself in order to understand them and be less judgmental and pin less of it on the individuals and pin more of it on the systems themselves. Yeah. And then it took becoming, like, I guess, an adult in the world, a coach. I had to get old enough to see it from different angles. Right. And then I thought maybe I'd be content to just know it for myself. Like, okay, I've figured some of this out. Now I can protect the athletes under my care. Right. But it just continued to burn inside me that it didn't matter how hard I tried with my athletes. This problem was everywhere. And with women's sports on the rise, if women's sports is on the rise as it is now, historically, like incredible things are happening for us. If we don't solve these baseline problems, they're just going to multiply exponentially as women's sports grows. Like popularity of women's sports doesn't solve the fundamental problems addressed in
the
my
system.
book.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it. Just like, that was the why.
Okay.
It was like, what can I do?
Yeah.
There's only so much a person can do when you're just a person.
Right.
But telling my story, writing it in a way that I felt like could awaken some hearts and minds, shift some thinking, then those can be seeds planted that can empower individuals. Where whoever picks up my book, I hope, can feel a little bit more empowered to change things for themselves and the people immediately around them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of a book, is you can literally reach like across the whole entire world, right? And what I loved about your book is that it is like goes so deep into your story and your experience, but then you also tie in like the research and the science and the data and like solutions. But one of the very first things that stood out to me when you started the book, like when you were young, was like, it seems like you always kind of had like this internal guidance, like this moral compass of what's right and what's wrong, and you were able to kind of sniff out like, this doesn't seem right. Like, I'm not really sure what this is, but it seems like female athletes shouldn't be treated this way. And I really like kind of held on to that the whole book, because I was like, wow, it seems like you had this really strong kind of internal guidance, like, and whether you agree with that or not, and kind of knew that at the time, but what was kind of like the first thing when you were young where you were like, something is just not right, and you kind of noticed that female athletes were getting treated differently, and there's a lot of discrepancy within female athletics?
Well, I think that there were a lot of little things I was picking up on as a kid, like, why aren't women's sports on TV? You know, I play softball. Why can't I watch women's softball? Why is it that my dad loves sports but never talks about female athletes? How come I pick up the sports page and I don't see women's sports? And this is before I was a hardcore athlete, right? But I think there's a certain amount of like, when you're growing up and you have these identities that you're discovering you're a part of. Woman, girl was one that I was discovering I was a part of. And when you're a kid, you're figuring out which of those are just givens, like they are not changeable, and which of these are changeable. And I didn't know at first. So I was noticing differences, but didn't know which ones to be upset about or not. And it wasn't until 8th grade when I lost I lost my status as like the fastest miler in the whole middle school to Rocky. And when a boy hits puberty and then suddenly blasts my time out of the water, a kid that I'd been beating week after week after week for a year and a half, that's when it really hit. Because then I was like, wait a second, this isn't fair. This isn't right. Like he didn't do anything to deserve that jump in
more
performance.
Than you. Yeah.
And is this the core of all the other things I've been noticing, that are different in men's sports versus women's sports or whatever? And then, I'm also observing what's happening in my own home between my dad and my mom in a heterosexual kind of traditionally gendered dynamic at that time too. So it was all very confusing, but like, I never identified strongly as a girl or a woman growing up. I just was like a person. And so it was very hard for me to have this like guy Rocky, why you? Why not me?
Right. Yeah. I mean, up until 12, right? It's like girls and boys, like physiologically were the same. It's like I had the same experience. Like I would always win in the mile in school, and then middle school comes and all of a sudden it starts changing. And that is confusing because it's not talked about, right? It's not like, hey, like puberty happens. And I remember in the book something about your dad saying that you get boobs and like girls get boobs and go make out behind the bleachers or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just interesting that it's the female development curve, or I guess curve. It's like, it's never talked about. And when it comes to girls quitting sports, I know like in the book, you talk about the research points to these 6 ways. But within those 6 ways, most common ways that girls drop out of sports, puberty is not mentioned in that. And I think that is probably one of the, like, why do you think that do you think it's just not studied and that's not why it's not like in the research, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that when the women's movement in the 70s and that second feminist wave was kind of gearing up to create more equality for 51% of the population, what made them effective as compared more effective than previous movements was that they took this tact of like, we're the same as you, right? We are the same as
Right.
you people that have rights, that have representation. So if we're the same as you, then why aren't we getting those things? And of course we are way more similar than we are different, right? Like there's a way more if you really like counted every single thing about us as human beings. But we are
Right.
like mostly a dimorphic species. Like there are these key differences. But if you focus on the sameness, you can achieve, it's easier to argue, we should have a credit card. We should be able to have property in our own name. We should be able to like, whatever those things, get a divorce. Like these things weren't even givens for our
Right.
parents' generation. And
Yeah.
we gained a ton of rights. That's how Title IX got passed. And we had to kind of work against this predominant logic that difference was bad. The reason why we were being excluded as women from equal rights was had these differences and they were core to our being. So we minimized them to the point of not talking about them at all. And now it's been long enough where we can see that like that does cause harm in the long run in a lot of ways, whether you're talking about sex, gender, race, ethnicity. Like if you ignore difference, if you're colorblind, if you're gender blind, if you're sex blind, like it's gonna cause some problems for some people because we are different and we're moving through the world in different ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually never really thought about it that way. And like the intentions of like minimizing differences are good, and that okay, so we have equality with a lot of things. But then the studies, the research, the conversations around the difference of women's bodies, like it's just not there. And so women and girls are thinking, okay, I'm supposed to have the same performance and supposed to be able to be on the same trajectory physical and performance wise as boys, but the reality is that's just not how our bodies are designed.
Yeah. And
Right.
then when we have this additional layer now where in some ways we're more ready to have this conversation than ever about difference, but then we also are in an era of like record transphobia and where difference is being used against trans people. And so the same conversations that needed to happen in my book that are really important for the 96 to 97% of women and girl identifying people, those are the types of arguments of difference used to harm trans people. And so there's like this, it makes it
Yeah.
hard to say, well, these are still conversations that need to happen and these sex-based differences still do matter, but we need to be able to hold those and talk about those and care about those alongside caring about trans lives, not allowing that information to be used to harm others. And that's hard to do because we don't live in a society of nuance. So I think that's one of the reasons I think
Right.
Women's Sports Foundation has shied away from talking about puberty and sex-based difference. That'd be a guess of mine, is that it is a little bit of a tricky area when you want
It
to be very
is.
inclusive. But again, like all of us matter. So we have to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think your book does a great job of like just opening up that conversation. And like as a female athlete, it's like I was not aware, I think, as you were at that age and like thinking about these things and just being really aware of like your body changing and boys' bodies changing or not changing or changing in a different way. But like for you personally, when you started hitting puberty, like what were some of the hardest things kind of as you kind of went into that puberty phase and started noticing those changes in your body?
I think that I had a lot of fear about changing into a woman's body because womanhood didn't stand for anything at that time that I wanted to be a part of. And so as long as I could maintain my prepubescent body, then I felt like safe and
Yeah.
protected from whatever that next thing was. Because the reality is, once you're in a woman's body, your body is no longer really yours in the patriarchal society we live in. Like people have opinions about your body, people sexualize your body,
Yeah.
and that's also what makes it difficult to talk about the body changes. Like if you're going to talk to teenagers about breast development, breasts are sexualized, and so if you're a male PE teacher, I can understand why that's a thing that you're just going to not talk
Right.
about. And
Right.
but you have to, because like, yeah. So I think that I was mostly afraid. It wasn't until I had started to have women role models in my life. Like I had a female assistant coach, Tracy McCauley,
Mm-hmm.
in high
Mm-hmm.
school, that was I'd say the first person that I felt like, okay, this person's like me. She loves to run. She's 10 years older than me. She's a teacher. And my mom was just, she obviously had so many things I admired about her, but she didn't work outside the home. That was something I knew for sure I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to do growing up. Motherhood was a big part of her identity, and I wasn't even sure I
Right.
wanted to have kids. And she was under the thumb of a very like domineering kind of machismo husband. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I
Right.
looked at her, I saw what I was terrified of, what womanhood could be that was terrifying. And when I looked at
Mm-hmm.
Tracy McCauley, I thought, okay, well, this is a different thing. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I can survive it. But even then, there was this asterisk of like, well, as long as I go through puberty in the right way, whatever that
Yeah.
means, like
Yeah.
the
Good luck.
least amount of puberty possible.
Yeah. Like you can choose.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, gosh,
Yeah.
when you think about it, what an amazingly intense experience that adolescent
Right.
female bodies go through, and male bodies, but like the female body in particular, because it just feels
Right.
like roulette a little bit, especially when we are taught that puberty is a death sentence for a female athlete in so many sports. When we look at it as a negative, which that's a huge part of my book, is like reframing that. If we are looking at it that way, then we end up
Mm-hmm.
with all this pain and suffering. And when we look at it as part of the female performance wave, it's a stage,
Yeah.
and that our ultimate strongest body is our adult female body, then, and we have to get there.
Mm-hmm.
The only way there is through some awkwardness. Then it
Right.
changes everything.
Right. And the only way through, I mean, you're going to have injuries, but like if you go through trying to minimize your puberty by, trying to stop your periods, and I definitely want to get into that a lot, and getting injured, like you're not going to get to that point of being at your peak performance.
Yep.
It's like you have to, and so I think that's why it's so important to understand the performance wave, to understand that like, hey, my best is yet to come. Like my best is going to be later on in life. So if I can just get through this like in the most
Yeah.
healthy, wholesome way possible, it's like then I can reach that peak. But I feel like so many athletes don't even get close to like that peak because they quit for whatever reason, or they
Yes.
have an unhealthy experience, whether that be eating disordered habits or anything like that. But I feel like so many women just don't make it to that point. But if they knew, then maybe there would kind of be that light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes. And that is why I wrote the book. Like right there is like,
Yeah.
if we just knew how many people's lives would be changed if, instead of viewing puberty as the death sentence that you're waiting for, like, am I or am I not going to have a future in this based on what happens to me in these 1 to 3 years and what happens to my body? Or like, people still don't believe me when I say I am 100% confident your 25-year-old self is stronger than your 14-year-old self, if you want to stick with it, like, or your 22-year-old self, like, and they're like,
Right.
no, like, there's such a strong myth that our body can change permanently in a way where our 14-year-old self is going to be the peak of our physicality. And that's completely insane that we've been led to believe that. And it's just, it doesn't play out in the research at all. And so like, if you just could really believe that truth, then yeah, you can have grace with yourself through these changes. You can think of yourself as like a chrysalis or whatever, instead of like,
Yeah.
whatever else we want to think of, like a graveyard, an athlete graveyard.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like, so getting into kind of like eating disorders and stuff, like I know it was like some crazy number of like 65% of female athletes like develop disordered eating habits. Like that blew my mind. Like
Yeah.
for me as a soccer player, and maybe it's different now, but or maybe I just didn't have awareness, but I never thought about disordered eating, or I never thought that it was very common, like at least in my sport. Like I don't know if that's true, or I was just totally in the dark about it. And I know it's more common with like running and probably gymnastics and those kind of sports. But that just kind of blew my mind how common it is. And it seems like almost you specifically, and it seems like runners have to choose almost between performance and health. Like, do I want to be the fastest, or do I want to be like healthy and not get injured? Like, did you kind of feel like there was almost that choice that had to be made between performance and health.
I definitely heard that story all around me. It was for
Yeah.
sure the story. And I
Yeah.
watched athletes around me buying into it. But then I watched what happened. Like some of them would
Right.
run really fast for a short period of time, but they
Mm-hmm.
always came crashing down. They always
Yeah.
broke a bone or multiple bones or tendons or ligaments. And so in the end, if you couldn't string together multiple seasons, then
Yeah.
your story gets cut off so short. And so maybe for
Right.
some people, that gamble is worth it for them. They just want to have one season and they don't care what their bone density is down the road. They don't care about any of that. But the thing is, a lot of people starve themselves and don't get faster because of the effects on mental health, anxiety. It
Mm-hmm.
decreases your pain tolerance. Your
Right.
immune system function goes down. So you can take that gamble and still lose. And if
Mm-hmm.
you kind of take that, I definitely don't believe that health and high performance are at odds. Um,
Yeah.
and I was able to hold on to that longer than a lot of my peers because I kind of got lucky with the way puberty changed my body. Like it didn't change it that
Mm-hmm.
much. It did change it.
Mm-hmm.
And I did
Yeah.
have a stagnation year
Right.
where I worked harder, but I didn't get any better and I got slower for a little while. And so I got enough of that experience to be able to empathize and identify with what was happening around me,
Mm-hmm.
but not so much of an experience where I wasn't able to then come out the other side and tell
Right.
this story. But I felt like very strongly that I wanted to be the example that you could be healthy and
Yeah.
fast at the same time. But that was a little bit hard to do because every cross country season I would come in the defending national champion on the track in the 5K and then lose to people in cross country who had temporarily starved themselves. They kind of came out of nowhere, won or whatever, beat me, and then disappeared
Yeah.
again. So it was
And
hard.
it's kind of like, I don't know if it goes back to the theme of puberty when the boys started beating you, that it's not fair. Did you ever have the like, it's not fair thing, like, because they're starving themselves and therefore they're, faster, which that's not always the case. But did you kind of have the feeling of like, this is unfair and like any anger towards them? Or was it more of like
Yeah.
compassion? Like, yeah, what were your
No,
like
at
feelings?
first, I mean, I have, like, I can be gentle on myself now, but I felt really bad
Yeah.
about this for a while that I just got mad at the women, at the girls. I got
Yeah.
mad at
Yeah.
them. I felt like it was a form of cheating. I
Hmm.
felt like it was unfair, and it's crazy to think about that now because again, it's just misplacing the blame on them when
Yeah.
they're in a culture that's encouraging them to do it, that's making them afraid
Yeah.
of having a healthy body, and telling them that these trade-offs are worth it. And there really are programs at the collegiate and high school level where female bodies are considered disposable in the name of getting points or winning.
Yeah. And I feel like, again, you did a good job of I can have performance and health, right? Whereas a lot of the thinking was probably like I can have one or the other, like the either
Hmm.
or. You were talking about you misplaced the blame on female athletes when it should have been on the system. In what ways do you feel like the system kind of creates this culture of disordered eating habits and skewed body image? And I know there's probably a million things, but what are some of the main things that people can kind of be aware of as far as the system goes?
I think systemically we suffer from a plague of ignorance, and it's really, I don't think that most of it is bad intentions or evil people or whatever. I think that we have been, like we said earlier in this conversation, minimizing difference for 50 years between female
Yeah.
and male bodies. And we had a good reason to do it, but now we're suffering the consequences. And so what we have is an entire coaching profession where no one has been required to learn anything about female
Mm-hmm.
athlete physiology as it differs from male athlete physiology. There is no requirement at all, which is mind-boggling
That
after
is,
you've read
yeah.
my book to see what the differences are and how fundamentally different the like lived experience is in a female body through puberty, right? Like in sport.
Mm-hmm.
And yet so if they don't have that awareness, then what the predominant concept is you can take what we do for male bodies, and we can do that for female bodies. And that if we don't
Right.
do it exactly like we're doing it for the male bodies, we're actually like insulting these females. We are telling them they're not good enough. They don't, and so there's a lot of coaches that'll, with pride, will say, I coach my women's team just like my men, or I coach my girls team just like the boys. And it's like, okay, but, and that also means there's an expectation that they will improve linearly, that what they get out is what they'll put, or what they put in is what they're going to get out. And that excellence looks like leanness. And that the more you like train, your body should respond in a certain way by getting leaner, by getting more chiseled. And that just is not the case for the vast majority of female bodies through adolescence. They will lean out after a while, but that is not the initial experience of puberty. There is a softening that must occur in order, like it just has to happen. So if you have coaches viewing that as you're not dedicated, you're not committed, there's a problem, and they pathologize it, and now they get you barking up all the wrong trees. Maybe it's your nutrition, maybe it's between your ears, maybe you need a sports psychologist, maybe you're just not motivated, and it's like, we are pathologizing puberty, and there's actually nothing wrong here. But they don't know, they don't know. So
it just blows my mind that it's such a big part of our lives that just kind of gets swept under the rug. And like you said, we just make it some pathology, right? And I think it does start. So would you say then that it starts at the top with the system, with the education, with the coaches?
Yeah, I think parents, coaches, I think we all need to just know these basics about female adolescence. I think that's really important. And we need to also know the cost of ignoring those differences. And what is a harmful message? Like, you need to lose weight. Someone could argue that's not a harmful message to give a 16-year-old girl. That's just part of sports. And that requires more information for a person to go, oh, I see now how that is so harmful and a completely inappropriate comment for that age of a person. But you don't know what you don't know. So I think that there's that. And then there's also like, we don't have any kind of protocol. Like, I know the NCAA only applies to a certain number, about 250,000 athletes or something, but there is no protocol for eating disorders. So we're creating environments that create them, that encourage them. But then when someone has one, and even though it's the second deadliest mental health disorder beside opioid addiction, we don't have any policy of what to do to make sure those athletes are receiving care, that they make a full recovery, or holding coaches responsible whose teams become particularly unwell. It's just like, whereas concussions, we have learned the harm of concussions. They're a thing that happens in sport, in the environment. We have protocols now. We have things that take it out of the individual hands of coaches, and they say, oh, there's a concussion here. We have to follow a protocol, and that's it. And that way it protects coaches from that responsibility of making a game time decision. They're just human beings, and they want to win. And it also protects athletes. And so we can do that, but we haven't. We haven't had the will to change any of it. We're still busy blaming the individual athletes for the problems that they're having.
Yeah, and I mean, the second deadliest, that's really insane. Second to opioids.
Yeah, it's serious. People don't think of it that way because diet culture is so prolific that it's like, how can it possibly be this bad? But it really is.
What are some of like the subtle signs that like parents and coaches can look out for when it comes to like disordered eating habits?
Just any kind of restriction, like if there's certain food groups that a person is avoiding when they weren't avoiding them before, and there's no allergy, like there's no like medical reason to avoid the food. A classic one is athletes becoming vegetarian or vegan, and it's not for environmental reasons. They may say it is, but just like even then, like a big shift in the diet where food groups are cut out, but their energy demands remain high. Start paying attention and engaging with that athlete, and make sure that their mindset is on, am I getting enough, instead of what do I need to cut out. Even if you're cutting out meat, like that's totally fine. Even if you want to be vegan, that's fine. But do they have this mindset of getting enough? And if they're not oriented that way, you be concerned. The weight loss doesn't always happen. It does happen to a certain amount of people, but a lot of eating disorders are invisible. They happen in larger bodied people. They happen in people that don't carry the like stereotypical body. And so another thing is just like skipping meals, bringing your own food to meals, or like avoiding social eating situations. Another sign is like baking things, but not eating any of them, like making food because you have the craving and you're hungry, but then giving it away and giving it away. Like that's another sign.
Yeah, those are all pretty subtle. And like you said, it's like not all eating disorders. It's not like you can see them all. Like some of them are, you can't really see it. You would maybe never know just by looking at a person. And I'm thinking like from a and a coach is, well, in college they might have a better idea, but like a youth coach is going to have very little idea of what their athletes are eating, right? But like how can a parent or coach like approach, like let's say that they notice that their athlete is like doing some of those things, like how can they approach it in a way that, especially I think male coaches would have a harder time, like they don't want to, they're not, who are they to say what they shouldn't be eating? Like how would you recommend coaches, I mean, and even parents kind of like approach the subject and kind of ask questions about it?
Well, from talking to my friend, Dr. Melody Moore, who's a clinical psychologist who specializes in eating disorders, her advice to me was to focus on the behavior, not the appearance of the person. And so like find a time when it's peaceful and calm and you're alone, or like aside from others, and just say, hey, I've noticed, and then name some behaviors. I've noticed that you aren't coming to team meals, or I've noticed that you don't order food when other people are ordering food, or the snacks that you bring yourself are like just vegetables. There doesn't seem to be a lot of nutritional like density or substance in the foods that I see you bringing to practice, or I don't see you eating at all, or I see that your energy is down, or I see that you're isolating. It seems like you're struggling with something. You're not interacting with your peers in the same way as you used to. And then just saying like, I'm worried about you. How are you doing? And start with a conversation like that. And if you focus on those behaviors and you ask them how they're doing, you may be surprised at how much they open up to you. And if not immediately in that moment, you can just say, hey, well, just know I see you're struggling. So my door is open. I'm going to check in again in a week and see how you're doing. Like go ahead and set up the next opportunity so they have time. Because when you're struggling with an eating disorder, you can be really isolated and alone. And the eating disorder, so this is why we don't talk about how someone looks, because if you talk to a person with eating disorder and you're like, I've noticed you've lost a lot of weight. The eating disorder part of the brain says they notice it's working.
It's good.
And that fuels the eating disorder, which is not what you want. That's
very important. That's something like so simple, but like so incredibly important as far as the consequences that can come from that.
Yes.
And then from there, it's like, okay, a coach notices this, they have the conversation. They don't feel like they know what to do. Like, would you then recommend a administrator or a coach or a parent to then seek some professional help at that point? And like, who helps with these kind of things?
Yeah. So if you're dealing with an underage person, then talking to the parents, having a similar conversation. Here's the behaviors I've noticed that have changed. I'm worried about so-and-so. We're a team here. I've got your kid with me this many hours a week, right? So I just want to bring this up. I'm concerned that there may be disordered eating or the beginnings of an eating disorder happening here. And this is a problem because, and so coaches need to know the basics of why it's a problem. This is like second most deadly mental health disorder. This, regardless of performance, which will be negatively impacted, if not immediately, then soon it will result in all the things that your athlete and you don't want: injuries, illness, increased anxiety, decreased mental health. This is not a path we want to go down, and it's a really common path for adolescent girls. So here's where this could go. Here's why it matters. And here's a recommendation of what to do about it. I'd send them to the NEDA website, NEDA, National Eating Disorder Awareness website, for just get on here, get some info. I think every coach should have a resource list of like who in their area is someone they could refer out people to. And a clinical psychologist who specializes in eating disorder recovery is like the gold standard, but I think there's only like a couple thousand in the whole country, right? And so you don't necessarily have to have that, but some mental health support is good. And And then,
Yeah.
from there, you got to work with a medical team to make sure that if things get really serious,
Yeah.
you definitely
Yeah.
need, there are recovery centers, there's inpatient, outpatient. One example is Opal in the Pacific Northwest, that even if you don't live in the Pacific Northwest, you could just look them up and see, like, here's somebody that I know is doing a good job, and what exists like that where I
Yeah.
live. And you
Right.
can look for that.
Yeah. So again, it kind of comes back to like educating and then developing protocols like around that
Hmm.
thing, just like concussions. Yeah.
And in an early intervention, I mean, not to like just
Yeah.
plug my book, but like give
No,
them my book.
for sure. Absolutely.
Because I think what it does is it will reflect back a lot of things that are little conversations that are happening in a deep, like shameful part of oneself. And so once you
Yeah.
can see those words on the page and be like, oh, other people, this is actually really common, this way of thinking, and this is why I'm thinking this way. And then that can be enough to like wake people up and motivate them to stop the bad behaviors, to intervene. And
Yeah.
that's good.
And I think especially for like girl athletes, I think the most important thing for them is that they can relate to you in this book, and that alone can, I think, change a lot of behavior and just create a lot of awareness around like their behaviors and the consequences of them.
Yeah. I don't think that a lot of athletes that enter into disordered eating have any idea of the
Yeah.
consequences. And
Yeah.
most of the time we frame them as down the road consequences. And
Right.
adolescent minds are just biologically have a harder time of being driven by long-term
Yeah.
consequences. And that's just part of brain development. And so, but we also that's why we need to make them aware of the short-term consequences. Like, this also isn't helping you now, this year or next year. Like,
Yeah.
here's the reasons why. And then that can be
Right.
motivating.
And one of those reasons is injury, right? And
Absolutely.
correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't have your first injury till you were 21?
Yeah. I had little
That's
things like missed three
insane.
or
Yeah,
four
but no
days.
big.
And
That's
that was
like
because I
so
was,
mind blowing.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to ask you is like why? Like how did like what would you attribute to you staying healthy for so long?
I really think it was that I had maintained a healthy relationship with food and my body for so long. Like, it wasn't that I never struggled. When you read the book, like,
Yeah.
I go through periods of time of mental anguish about body changes and changes in how running feels and how performance turns out. But it isn't until I'm 21 or 21 that I start buying into the systems that have been negatively impacting all my peers. And I start dieting and I start trying to change my body into something that it doesn't want to be. And then as a result, I end up with relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS. I end up depleting bone mass. And there's like one little page in the book where I just talk about all the things that were happening under the surface that were invisible to me. Like, above the surface, I'm like, oh, I'm running well and I'm improving and
Yeah.
I'm holding on to my national title. But there's this like foreshadowing of my bone cells aren't laying down at the same rate they're being broken down anymore, and neither are my tendon cells and my immune system. Like, all these things are just starting to erode,
Yeah.
like the foundation underneath a house is starting to like break down, and they'll come and get me later. And that's also why there's a delay in when the things sink into a problem, and there's also a delay in getting back to health, because
Right.
once you
Absolutely.
recognize that you have REDS or an eating disorder, it takes like stacking together several months to sometimes a few years of improved behavior and sufficient nutrition before you stop the injury cycle, because you have to like reload your depleted bank account to neutral, and then it gets above neutral.
Right. Like you can't expect that, okay, it took this long for me to deteriorate, but then I'm going to be able to just come back like that. You know what I mean? It's kind of this understanding of like it compounding over time, and also this delayed gratification like when you're working back to health. But yeah, that's just crazy. Like for me, I tore my ACL when I was 12 years old. So like injury was part of my life like so early on.
Dang.
Yeah, so to hear that, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. And I think, like you said, it's like the reason why that happened is because then that's when you started buying into the system. And so it was like, you knew, you were aware this whole time, but you weren't perfect. And that's what I think is so great about the book is it's not like you were just perfect Heidi Ho this whole time. Like you had these ups and downs and you grappled with, going into the system and you did, and then you suffered the consequences of it and obviously learned from it, got stronger from it. But yeah, this has been one of my favorite books of the year. And I think probably the most important book that I've read for female athletes, for coaches, for parents. This is absolutely to plug your book 100%. Like that's what I wanted to have you on for. And kind of my last question, which isn't really related to what we've been talking about. Just me personally, I love this. I feel like nature is a big part of your life, of your physical, mental health, like whatever that be. And I know like when you were running, you did this like kind of grounding exercise where you lay down on the ground, and that really helped you mentally before games. Like what role does nature play in your life now, and did it for you as an athlete, just as like a human being?
Yeah, well, I think that initial scene in the book of what my teammates called soaking in the field, I had no idea how big and important that act was. And it like came later in my life learning about it in sports psychology or meditation, things unrelated to sport, that this practice of grounding yourself is so important. And so I think like the thing is we're animals, right? Like if we're going to talk about the biology of us changing in adolescence, like all species of animal go through these changes, these metamorphoses in their own way. And I think that's part of what draws us to movement, to playing outside, is we're getting out of the cage, we're getting into the world, our feet are on the ground, the air is, the wind is in our hair, the air is in our lungs, and we're doing what our bodies are built to do. We're just doing them in this constructed arena of play that we have created to fit in with our culture and our society, right? So, so when you ground yourself, when I was laying down on the ground, I think that was kind of like the official welcoming of here I am. Yeah. I'm in this space. Like I'm where I'm supposed to be. Like, let's go be my animal self now. I'm connected to this earth. I'm not separate from this earth. I'm connected to this earth. And so is everybody here. So let's do this.
And it gets you just into your body, out of your
head. Yeah, it's athlete, so good. It's like
good. You don't need your mind. You just need to like trust your body and be in your body, and you're going to perform, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what, if you're around little kids, they just burst into a run. If they find a ball, they kick it, they throw it. Like it's instinctual. This is what we're supposed to do, right? So it's just like returning to that child self, and like getting rid of the overthinking, and like your body knows what to do. So just go do it.
Yeah, love that. All right. Well, I would love for you to just share where I'll obviously put the link to the book, but also where can people connect with you? I love your social media as well. So yeah, where can people connect with you, social media, and anything else that you want to share?
Well, I'm on Instagram, Fleshman Flyer. LaurenFleshman.com is my website, which I'm kind of revamping right now because the paperback version of my book is being released this month. And so I've been really excited about that because it makes it much more accessible price-wise to a lot more people, especially young people. And so just things to keep in mind, like I can get there will be team discounts made available for the book. I'm doing this promotion where if 25 copies are sold, I'll do a 30-minute Zoom with a team. Awesome. So I know that's a lot of books, but I just really want them out in the world. So
that's amazing. Yeah. Awesome. So I will make sure. Okay, cool. Yep. We'll link this up. We'll get this out to coaches. Okay. 30 books. That's the discount. 30 books.
25.
25. Oh, that's totally doable. We'll get it out. That's totally doable. Okay. Awesome, Lauren. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Make sure you guys check out her Instagram. Go grab her book if it's the only book you read this year. And thanks again, Lauren. Appreciate you having you on. Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.